When we speak about prayer, our minds often go to words, to supplications, to verses, to the rhythmic repetition of dhikr. But there is a deeper dimension to worship that is often forgotten: silence. There are moments when the most sincere form of connection with Allah does not require sound at all. It is the silence that exists between the words, the quiet stillness of the heart that says more than the tongue ever could. Sometimes silence itself becomes a language understood only by the one who fashioned the heart and knows every thought before it is formed. You see, we live in a world that constantly urges us to express, to explain, to justify, to verbalize everything we feel. But the spiritual journey often begins where expression ends. When the noise fades and the soul finally rests, we begin to hear the subtle whispers within us, the murmur of faith, the quiet remembrance that does not need to be spoken. The Prophet would often withdraw into moments of deep reflection and silence. Before revelation descended upon him, he would retreat to the cave of Hira, not to speak, not to debate, but to reflect in the stillness of creation. In that silence, he met truth. It teaches us that silence is not emptiness, it is presence. It is a meeting point between the finite and the infinite. Psychologically, silence has a purifying effect. The human heart is constantly surrounded by noise, external and internal. The chatter of the world and the chatter of our own minds. We're constantly reacting, thinking, responding. But prayer, real prayer, requires stillness, a slowing down of the self so that the soul can realign with its source. When we enter that silence consciously, we begin to sense how restless we've become. We notice the turbulence of our thoughts, the weight of our worries, the loudness of our desires. And as we sit quietly in that discomfort, something remarkable begins to happen. The noise begins to settle. The surface of the heart, once disturbed, becomes still enough for divine reflection to be seen within it, like a lake that reflects the sky only when it's calm. Philosophically, silence is the soul's acknowledgement of its limitations. Words can only reach so far. Beyond that point, silence takes over. There are experiences of the divine that words simply cannot hold. To be silent before Allah is not to be empty. It is to be full of awe, full of awareness, full of submission. It is the realization that sometimes the truest form of dhikr is not saying Subhanallah aloud, but feeling it echo within your chest. When the heart says, Wa Allah, without the tongue moving, that is a level of intimacy no language can replicate. Even in our personal prayers, there are moments when we find ourselves lost for words. We try to articulate our pain or gratitude, but the emotions are too deep, too complex. And in that moment of wordless surrender, Allah still hears. The silence itself becomes the dua. Every heartbeat says what the lips cannot. Every tear carries a message the tongue cannot form. Silence then is not absence, it is communication on a higher plane. It is the soul speaking directly to its creator without the interference of speech. So perhaps the next time you feel distant from Allah, do not rush to fill the air with words. Sit quietly, close your eyes, breathe. Let your heart speak in its native language, silence. Reflect on how even the universe worships without sound, the stars in their orbits, the trees in their stillness, the oceans in their rhythm. All creation praises Him, and most of that praise is silent. The truth is, silence refines sincerity. It strips away performance. It removes the temptation to be heard by others and leaves only the desire to be known by Allah. And that is the essence of true worship. So the next time your heart trembles, but your lips remain still, know this: your silence is not a void. It is a conversation between you and your Creator, one too sacred for words. And sometimes the most powerful prayer is the one that is never spoken, only felt. There are moments in life when silence is not merely the absence of speech, it is the presence of wisdom. To remain silent when every part of you wants to respond, to explain, to justify, that is an act of discipline, and discipline is the essence of faith. You see, not every thought deserves to be spoken, not every feeling deserves to be shared. There is a kind of strength that comes from restraint, a spiritual dignity that emerges when you choose silence over reaction. And when that silence is motivated by consciousness of Allah, by tarawa, it becomes more than self-control. It becomes Our tongues are one of the greatest gifts Allah has given us, and yet also one of the greatest tests. The Prophet told us that one of the main reasons people are thrown into the fire is the misuse of the tongue. Words once released cannot be taken back. They can heal or they can harm. They can build bridges or destroy relationships. So when a believer restrains their tongue out of awareness of Allah, that silence is not wasted. It becomes an unspoken act of worship. It is a way of saying, well, Allah, I could speak, but I choose not to for your sake. In our daily lives, we often feel compelled to speak, to defend ourselves, to win arguments, to express anger or frustration. But silence in those moments is not weakness, it is mastery of the self. It's a recognition that your worth is not determined by the last word you say, but by the peace you preserve. Silence is a form of emotional intelligence, a psychological strength that reflects spiritual maturity. Because when you are silent with intention, you are not suppressing, you are transcending. You are rising above the noise of ego and choosing serenity over chaos. Even in our relationships, silence can be a mercy. Think of how many conflicts could be avoided if we paused before reacting, if we gave space for reflection before response. The Quran says, "The servants of the most merciful are those who walk upon the earth humbly, and when the ignorant address them harshly, they say peace." Notice, they do not argue, they do not retaliate, they choose calm over conflict. That is not passivity, that is power. That is the kind of silence that glorifies Allah because it comes from humility and trust. Philosophically, silence becomes a mirror of faith. When you hold your tongue, you acknowledge that you are not the ultimate judge. Allah is. You trust that truth does not always need your defense, that justice does not always require your voice. There is a serenity that comes when you realize that Allah hears what others do not, sees what others ignore, and records what others forget. In that awareness, silence transforms from inaction to reliance. It is an expression of tawakkul, trusting Allah to manage what words cannot fix. Psychologically, silence protects the heart from the heaviness that speech often brings. Every unnecessary word, every argument, every complaint, it leaves a residue on the soul. Over time, that residue dulls the light within. But when you learn the art of restraint, you keep your heart pure, your mind clear, and your soul tranquil. The saints of the past would say that silence is the door to wisdom because it allows the heart to listen before the tongue speaks. And listening, truly listening, is an act of humility before Allah and His creation. So when you find yourself in a situation where your silence feels heavy, where you want to react, to prove to be heard, pause. Remind yourself that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. It is not that you are unable to speak, it's that you choose not to because you are aware that Allah is watching. And that awareness, that moment of deliberate restraint is in itself a form of ibadah. In a world where everyone is shouting to be heard, be the one who finds meaning in quiet. Be the one whose silence is not emptiness but remembrance. Because when you hold your tongue for the sake of Allah, your silence is no longer mere absence. It becomes presence, presence with Him. And in that sacred stillness, you will find that what silence protects, words could never have preserved. One of the greatest challenges of our age is the constant noise that surrounds us. Everywhere we turn, there is sound, notifications, conversations, media, opinions, endless chatter. We have become so accustomed to this external noise that silence feels unnatural, even uncomfortable. Yet the truth is, the human soul was not designed for constant stimulation. It was designed for stillness, for moments of quiet where the heart can breathe, reflect, and remember. That is why silence is not only a spiritual discipline, it is a psychological necessity. It is the space where the heart recalibrates, where the soul finds its way back to Allah. When life becomes loud, our inner voice, that delicate compass of faith, gets drowned out. We start reacting to everything around us, constantly seeking distraction to escape our own thoughts. But when you deliberately choose silence, when you sit with yourself and allow the noise to fade, something profound begins to happen. You start hearing again, not the world, but yourself. You begin to feel what you've been avoiding. You become aware of your fears, your desires, your gratitude, and your dependence on Allah. That awareness is the beginning of spiritual healing. Because before you can fix the heart, you must first be able to hear it. Modern psychology confirms what our spiritual tradition has always taught, that silence nurtures mindfulness. When you slow down the constant stream of words and thoughts, you begin to observe rather than react. The Prophet A would take time to reflect, to sit quietly, to ponder. That practice, in its essence, is mindfulness anchored in divine awareness. It's not about emptying the mind, but filling it with presence, being aware that you are seen by Allah. Even in your stillness, silence becomes a form of a muraqabah, spiritual consciousness. It transforms ordinary moments into sacred reflection. Philosophically, silence is also an act of humility. It is the recognition that not everything needs to be said and not every answer needs to be found immediately. When you allow silence to exist, you make room for wisdom to emerge. The Quran often invites us to reflect, to ponder, to think deeply. And reflection requires stillness. The heart cannot reflect while it is restless. Like a body of water, it only becomes clear when it is calm. And when it becomes clear, it reflects divine truth. There's a reason why some of the most powerful moments of connection with Allah occur in solitude. When you stand in prayer at night, when the world is asleep and no sound fills the air except your own breath, that silence carries a sacred weight. It's as if the entire universe is paused, listening to the quiet dialogue between your heart and its creator. In those moments, you realize that silence is not empty. It is full of presence, full of remembrance, full of divine intimacy. But achieving this stillness requires intention. You must be willing to detach, even briefly, from the noise that consumes your day. Silence doesn't always mean being alone. It means being inwardly still even amidst movement. It means walking through the chaos of life with a heart that is anchored in calm. And this calm is not apathy, it is clarity. When your heart is silent, you can distinguish between impulse and insight, between emotion and truth. You begin to act from understanding, not reaction. That is what gives a believer their composure, their serenity, their unshakable peace. We must remember that silence is not the absence of communication with Allah, it is its refinement. Words are valuable, yes, but when words fall short, silence completes the conversation. In those moments when you sit quietly, reflecting on His blessings, His power, His mercy, that is worship. It is dhikr without sound, gratitude without speech, surrender without argument. It is the heart bowing in awe before the divine. So make space for silence in your life, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of awareness. Disconnect from the world long enough to reconnect with the one who created it. Because when the noise fades, you will realize something beautiful. Allah was never distant. You were just too distracted to notice. And in that moment of quiet realization, your silence itself becomes prayer, a testimony that the heart, when still, remembers its source. There are moments in life when words simply fail us, when the depth of what we feel cannot be captured by any sentence, when our pain, our awe, or our longing defy expression. In those moments, silence becomes our only language. It is then that silence itself transforms into a form of prayer, not a prayer of speech, but of surrender. When the believer stands before Allah, stripped of words, stripped of explanations, and simply breathes in His presence, that is not emptiness. That is the most profound kind of sidua, one made not with the tongue, but with the heart. Every one of us has faced times when we wanted to say something to Allah, but couldn't. Not because we didn't care, but because what we felt was too vast to articulate. Maybe it was during loss, when your tears said more than your supplications ever could. Maybe it was in gratitude so deep that you found yourself speechless. Or maybe in confusion, when you had no clarity, only submission. In those moments, the silence between you and Allah is sacred. It is not neglect. It is recognition that He knows what you cannot express, that He understands what you cannot describe. When you think about it, this is the essence of surrender. To trust that Allah comprehends you even in your silence. The Quran reminds us, He knows what the soul whispers, and we are closer to Him than His jugular vein. That verse alone teaches us that communication with Allah is not bound by words. Before a sound escapes your lips, before a thought forms in your mind, He already knows. Silence then becomes an acknowledgement of His perfect knowledge. It is the believer's quiet declaration, Wallah, you see, you understand. Philosophically, silence before the divine is the highest form of humility. It is the recognition of human limitation before infinite wisdom. Words often arise from our need to control, to make sense, to explain. But silence is born from surrender, from admitting that not everything can be reasoned through or solved. There are times when Allah's decree leaves you bewildered, when you have no answers, only faith. To be silent in those moments is not resignation, it is reverence. It is standing before the divine and saying, I do not understand, but I trust you. And psychologically, that surrender has a healing power because silence removes the pressure to have everything figured out. It frees you from the illusion that your words or reasoning are what hold your world together. You begin to find peace not in explanations, but in acceptance. The silence of the heart becomes the soil in which contentment grows. It teaches you to sit with your emotions, to feel them fully without letting them rule you. In that stillness, you discover a subtle kind of faith, not the faith that shouts, but the faith that whispers, Allah is enough for me. See, even the greatest of prophets experienced this kind of silence. When Musa Isaiah stood before the burning bush, he did not argue. He listened. When Maryam bore the weight of accusation and pain, she was commanded to remain silent, and Allah Himself spoke in her defense. Their silence was not weakness, it was surrender, trust, and dignity. Through them, Allah teaches us that sometimes silence is not the absence of prayer, but the proof of it. So, when your voice falters and your heart feels heavy, don't think your silence distances you from Allah. It might be the very moment you are closest to Him. Because words are for the world, but silence, that sacred stillness, is for the soul. It is where you stop talking to Allah and start resting in Him. And perhaps that is what we all need to remember, that when words fall short, when the heart trembles and the eyes overflow, your silence still reaches the heavens. For the Lord who hears every whisper also understands every quiet sigh. So let your silence be your prayer, your surrender, your trust. Because sometimes the loudest form of worship is the quiet acceptance that Allah already knows.